This is why narcissism is so confusing. Narcissistic people are not going around trying to find traumatized people. They're trying to find good supply. Praise, admiration, validation, having a really attractive spouse, have a really nice car, having a really big job. And now, if that supply happens to have a trauma history,
meet Dr. Ramani,
the world's #1 expert on narcissism.
narcissistic people are sort of almost trapped at the stage of development between 3 and 4 years of age. The problem with narcissism is the narcissistic person blames the other person for their tantrum. The 4-year-old says, "Mommy, it's your fault I'm doing this." Sort of cute in a 4-year-old, but I'm still going to put you in the corner. What's the equivalent of the corner for the narcissist as an adult? We don't have that.
Okay, so I want to ask a personal question. So last night, my wife and I, we had a little bit of a tiff, and I was like,
That wasn't okay.
welcome to another episode of Unlock Your Potential. This is Jeff Lerner, your host. Excited to be back having amazing conversations with amazing human beings. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ramani Durvasula, known generally as Dr. Ramani. She's a licensed clinical psychologist based out of Los Angeles, currently in New England, home with family for the holidays. But she is, like I said, a licensed clinical psychologist in the LA area. She's a professor of psychology at California State University and the founder and CEO of Luna Education, Training, and Consulting. If you are watching this on YouTube and you're already thinking, hey, this Dr. Ramani looks familiar, you've probably seen her around as an expert on narcissism and dealing with narcissists. She's the author of several books, including Should I Stay or Should I Go? Surviving a Relationship with a Narcissist, and Don't You Know Who I Am? How to Stay Sane in an Era of Narcissism, Entitlement, and Incivility. She's done TED Talks. She's been on the Today Show. She's kind of all over the place as an expert on narcissism, has a new book out called It's Not You. And I know because we've had narcissism focused conversations on this show before, and it's an extremely, although unfortunately, popular subject that so many people deal with. So I know this is going to be a great one. Welcome, Doctor, to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So excited to be to have you here. And so I always, I have a friend who is one of your peers in the world of sort of like educating people on how to deal with narcissists. And I asked her, and I'll ask you the same thing, like, how does one get into this? Like what drew you to narcissism as a topic for a professional orientation?
Yeah, it was kind of an indirect path. It wasn't some grand personal moment. Initially, it was because I was actually an academic, and we were doing community-based research. Back in the day, I was also doing a lot of research on HIV and AIDS, and specifically sort of behaviors in people to sort of, again, stop transmission, and people who already had HIV, all of that. And one thing we noticed was that my staff would come in from these community clinics out in the field, and they would look really exasperated when they got back to the main line at the university. And I'd say, "What's up?" And they said, "Oh my gosh, like there are people who come in and they're so demanding and they ruin everyone's day, blah, 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 blah." And I said, that's interesting. I knew what they were describing. They were describing really people with really difficult personalities. And that kind of took me down the rabbit hole. As anyone looked at difficult personalities and sort of healthcare and health behaviors, and not much. And then at the same time, I also had a private practice, and people were coming in again and again and again with the same sort of relationship story. And once they got some education on narcissism and sort of the unchangeability of it, that sort of shifted their focus. But what really struck me was, for all the talk about narcissism in the world of mental health, there was virtually nothing on the impact of narcissism on other people. There was a smattering of studies here and there, books here and there, but mostly 90% of the literature was on narcissism itself, but not the significant impact this makes on other people. And that's what sort of started me down this rabbit hole. I mean, it turned out it was almost like a backwards experience, because as time went on, and I suppose the universe kind of guides us to where we need to get to, this was a lot of my life, right? It was intimate relationships, it was family relationships, I had workplace relationships like that, friendships. And my tendency was to wonder, what's wrong with me? There's something not quite right with me. I'm doing something wrong. And as I did the work more and more and more, and it really wasn't for the longest time at all, a journey of self-discovery. It was really the sense of, I want to understand this, because the more I was educating clients about it, the more I was using it as a research frame. I'm like, wow, the pieces are falling into place. And that's how I got started on this.
So I mentioned I have a friend that's, in the narcissism education space, and she got into it as a divorce attorney, where she said she realized that there was this sort of relatively small percentage of her cases that were by far the most problematic and difficult and toxic, and maybe it wasn't terrible for her as an attorney because they probably also billed a lot of hours, but it was always divorces that involved one or the other party being, what she dubbed or identified as like having narcissistic traits, and that these divorcing a narcissist is 100 times more complicated than divorcing basically anyone who isn't a narcissist.
Absolutely.
And it just like, and then, kind of same thing, the ripple effect. So let me start with the first thing that came to mind as you were talking about it. Two things came to mind. I'll start with the first one, which is, where do you draw the line as a clinical psychologist, right? So you are, sort of scientifically oriented in your study of this, as opposed to my friend who's an attorney, let's say. But as a clinical psychologist, where do you draw the line between saying this person is a narcissist and this person suffers from narcissistic personality disorder formally?
It almost doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because more often than not, I'm working with people who are the survivors of these relationships, right?
So you're saying it's not usually the narcissist coming to you for help?
No, not as a rule. I mean, I've worked with many narcissistic people in practice, but what brings a narcissist in the door is actually what brings a lot of people into therapy. Something in their life isn't going the way they want it to. Marriage problems, workplace problems, sometimes it's for optics, but life isn't going the way they want. They sort of feel owed that life should go the way that they want. And what gets interesting is, from the jump, the narcissistic clients tend to be more demanding around how they want an appointment and how they want things to unfold, and that they deserve more time, and the time that so you already get it on the front end. That's a small percentage. So because most of what I'm dealing with is mostly people coming in because they're being harmed by narcissistic people, whether it's a parent or a partner or colleague or friend or anyone, I'm not really in a position, and nor do I need to issue a diagnosis on that other person, if that makes sense.
Sure.
This idea of the diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder is such a problematic kind of wrinkle. To me, it's a pointless diagnosis. We don't get any juice out of that orange. There's really no point, because at the end of the day, there's almost no evidence base. There's no randomized clinical trials. There's no treatment that shows excellent long-term outcome. If a person has money and they have motivation, and they go to therapy with someone really good once or twice a week for many, 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 many years, yeah, you might get a unicorn that might have some change. And since that's not 99% of people who have this personality style, you have a bunch of people with this personality style who are simply not going to change. So having this be called a disorder helps no one. Giving a diagnosis means we're going to treat someone. You tell me someone has major depressive disorder, I know what the menu is for how to treat this person. You tell me somebody has schizophrenia, we know how we're going to treat them. Even if someone has addiction, we know how we're going to pursue that. But narcissistic personality disorder, I'm telling you now, the vast majority of clinicians will never give that diagnosis for a couple of reasons. One, it's something you don't figure out the first time you meet someone. It can actually take several months to figure that out, number one. Number two, an insurance company is going to balk. So we also have that other exigency kind of at play. So nobody's really getting this diagnosis. So any epidemiology statistics or numbers we get on this is done in research studies, which is a pretty rarefied space. So I always tell people, we're going to get rid of this diagnosis soon. Mark my words. The International Classification of Diseases was already given it the boot. And it's a matter of time before the people at DSM finally get their heads together and get rid of it too, because it doesn't matter. So people say, what's that line? What is the line? Honestly, when we give someone a diagnosis of a personality disorder, it simply means that this is a person for whom there's 9 things that make someone narcissistic, and they've got 5 of them, and it's been consistent and stable over time, and a licensed mental health practitioner saw it, documented it, and wrote it. So my point in saying this is there are people out there with a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder because they ended up in the right shrink's office who did evaluate them, who did put it on their record. But just because somebody has the diagnosis, it doesn't mean that their narcissism, as it were, is more severe than someone who doesn't have the diagnosis. There's a lot of people out there, your friend's divorce practice, who are in marriages with people you may know or work with people we know. They are far more narcissistic than someone with the diagnosis. But if they have not been in a clinical setting and gotten evaluated in a certain way, they're never going to get the diagnosis. So getting the diagnosis of NPD is not an indicator of severity. It's just an indicator of the stars lining up for somebody being in the certain office with a certain shrink who evaluated them a certain way. That's it.
Yeah, and I gotta, have to imagine the vast majority of narcissists. I mean, part of narcissism is particularly concerned with the labels that get attached to themselves. And so they don't want to wear a label of having a personality disorder. So they probably resist whatever would result in that diagnosis in the first place. I am curious, just as an aside. So when I've always kind of wondered this about personality disorders. So you have like borderline, you have antisocial, you have obsessive compulsive. Like, what really is the difference between a personality disorder and just a set of dysfunctional personality traits? Is it what you said? Is it just like, well, there's a number of traits, and if somebody hits a certain threshold, then it qualifies as a formal disorder?
Yep.
And that's really it.
That's it. That's it.
So it is kind of useless in a sense.
It's completely useless. It's useless, and it's muddying the waters because it makes people leery of using the word, thinking that they're using, for example, a diagnostic term. Narcissism, the word, actually describes a personality style similar to the way someone could have an agreeable personality. They could have a neurotic personality. They could have a stubborn personality. It's just an adjective.
Gotcha. Okay. Next thing that came to mind when you were talking, and I just want to sort of get this out on the table for context, because it's my frame it's part of my frame for understanding narcissism. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the book People of the Lie by Scott Peck? Is that
you know what? I've skimmed it. I've had a lot of clients who have read it and have been very, very affected and impacted by it. Yes.
Yeah. So Scott Peck, Road Less Traveled. I think most people in psychology know him. People of the Lie was his attempt to create sort of a morally objective or non-moral objective classification and definition of evil, human evil, so that we could have a sort of a medical pathology approach to treating evil rather than moralizing and judging it, which doesn't really get us very far. And in his work on like what fundamentally is human evil, the two convergent traits that he said resulted in human evil are narcissism and laziness.
Oh, that's interesting about the laziness. I mean,
it's when you put them together that you go to full-blown evil. And so it's a great book. It affected me a lot, which is why even though I read it 20 years ago, I can still tell you what it said. But I just think that's relevant to the conversation. That is my frame on narcissism, is that it's part of this, it's like a key ingredient in the stew of like human toxic destruction.
It can, yes, because what gets interesting is narcissism's on a spectrum. It's not an either or. It's not that you're narcissistic or you're not. It ranges from mild to severe. A mild narcissistic person to me is not even in the neighborhood of evil. They're kind of pathetic. They're immature. They're ridiculous. They're annoying. They're certainly not someone you would want to rely on. Evil? No. But as you climb up that spectrum to severe narcissism, and then you start going to its near cousin, psychopathy, now you've got evil, right? And when you jump that, because narcissism and psychopathy are not the same thing, and I wouldn't even argue they're on the same continuum. There's a discontinuity between the two. And when you jump over into psychopathy, where I truly believe we get into, if you will, evil, is that absolute lack of remorse. Narcissistic people actually do feel guilty, and more than anything, they feel shame when they do the wrong thing by someone. They just don't take responsibility for it.
That's interesting, because I don't know that the conventional wisdom out there necessarily knows what you just said.
Yes, no, they don't. And they should, because I think everyone's using these big words, but they don't know what the heck they mean. And so we're having these really muddy conversations. Psychopathy is a relatively, thank goodness, rare state, less than 1% of the population. Psychopathy, you're either going to find this person maybe running a large company, or you're going to find them in prison. You're definitely not going to find them as typically not a first grade teacher. These are not warm, fuzzy people. There is a callous, calculated, really kind of superficial intelligence, superficial charm, but there's a coldness there. And it's that calculated kind of sense of the psychopath, which is these are people who can lie to your face and not break stride. These are people whose autonomic nervous systems are different, which is why a psychopathic CEO will lay off 15,000 people and still take in his $20 million bonus and feel absolutely nothing. I personally would throw up for a year and fail at the job in the first day. I couldn't imagine doing that. It doesn't even affect them. And so narcissistic people actually are quite insecure, quite fragile. They don't necessarily like doing bad things, but they do them quite a bit because there's an impulsivity to narcissism. There's an entitlement. There's a selfishness. It's like a spoiled child. And so that spoiled childness means they do things that hurt people. They cheat on spouses. They embezzle money. They lie. They spread rumors. All kinds of things that are really hurtful. And they hope to hell they don't get caught. And when they get caught, unlike a psychopath who will be absolutely a cool operator, lie detector tests don't work on people who are truly psychopathic. Narcissistic person, that thing's going to be going off like it's the 4th of July. Narcissistic people actually, they'll lie to your face, but they're not really good at it. And they will get caught, and then the shame will break them. But then they'll usually blame, I cheated on you because you gained weight. Like they'll have no problem doing that. Or I cheated on you because you spend more time with the kids. Or I cheated on you because you're not nice enough to me. So they'll project blame on the other person. Psychopathic person will be like, yeah, I cheated on you. Yeah, get over it. Get the hell out of my face. Like it's gold. And so there is and because of that difference, and I think people miss that, if our entire conception of narcissism is that more severe, almost psychopathic adjacent narcissism, that's actually a very small percentage of it. And a lot of it, including what I write about in my book, is in more of that moderate, even mild level of narcissism, which, don't get me wrong, messes up relationships. But when we're going to start throwing around words like evil, I mean, even the famed psychologist Fromm had written, like, malignant narcissism is evil, right? And so malignant narcissism, psychopathy, now we're talking about something called the dark tetrad. And that's where we see the confluence of narcissism, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, which is the willingness to take advantage of other people, and sadism, which is willful cruelty. And personally, I throw into the mix paranoia, because these are folks who think everyone's out to get them. There's a sense of there's always a witch hunt. I have a target on my back. Everyone wants to get me. Everyone's trying to, everyone's come in for me. And so there's this constant threat perception, and people, when they feel threatened, they tend to attack. So there's this constant sense of attack. And when that's where we also see states like sociopathy, really kind of unhinged people who always think everyone's out to get them, and they're always gunning for a fight. So it's a messy kind of little evil world there.
So I would say I'm a moderate Jordan Peterson fan, which means I've listened to enough of him to be pretty versed in the dark tetrad, because he talks about that a lot. So I'm curious, a little more to my frame. I'm not at any level any sort of licensed or credentialed psychologist or psychology person. That said, I'm probably about as into psychology as you can be without having achieved any credential in that field. And so the thing that comes to mind for me whenever we get into these personality, I won't call them personality disorders, but disordered personality trait sets, let's say, are the Irrational Musts by Albert Ellis, the rational emotive behavior therapy guy, where he said, that essentially all of these dysfunctional personality types or aspects come down to what he called the three musts of irrational thinking, that there's like these three core nonsensical attitudes that we hold that are actually the genesis of all of our personality disordered traits. And one is, I actually Googled them because I can never remember them literally, but it's, I must do well and win others' approval or else I am no good. So that it's like my okayness or my merit as an individual is associated with other people's approval, sort of optical perception of me. That's not, that God never came down and wrote that as a law for humanity. Somebody just made that up, that I must do well and win the approval of others or else I'm not okay, right? His second is others must treat me fairly and kindly and the way that I want them to treat me. And if they don't, then they're bad and they deserve to be punished. And then the third is I must always get what I want when I want. And it, you can sort of sum all that up as saying like, this is all ridiculous. The universe owes you nothing, including comfort or joy or happiness or any such thing. But to the extent that you think that it does, it'll show up in your life as a personality, as some sort of disordered operating system in the world. And so I'm curious if that, because if I look at narcissism through that lens, like, is that a good lens to look at narcissism through? Because it seems like these are things that narcissists pretty strongly, almost insist on.
They do. I mean, the challenge with these musts is I think that, when we look back to folks that are very cognitive, behavioral, and frankly rational in their approach, we sometimes lose some of the trauma-informed quality of this. And so your first thing of your musts, I must do well and win the approval of others or I'm not good. Okay. The first place I go when I hear something like that is I go to a very trauma-informed place and I go to an attachment-informed place, which is that there are many people out there for whom if they do not win the approval of fill in the blank, and when they were children, the parent, then that's existential dread, right? Because then I won't be loved. Then I won't be cared for. Then, frankly, I won't survive. And so when people have non-attuned parents, which personally I think the universe does owe us, when people don't have attuned parents, then they will spend the rest of their lives either in this sort of trauma kind of focused, I've got to please other people or I am completely screwed. Or I have to substantiate myself by getting external approval. And here's where it gets interesting. The narcissistic person is caught in this chronic dilemma of their existence only happens when it's validated from the outside in. For the healthy human being, our central core sense of identity is what substantiates us. And we have that and we go through the world. And while we have the capacity to obviously to respond to the situation we're in, we know who we are, right? That's what a healthy human being is. And the only way you can really get there, the straight path there, is to have attuned, available, consistent caregivers in early life, because then the child just gets to be a child and gets to develop an identity. The majority of children don't get that. So the majority of children are put in roles where they have to step up, care for parents, avoid harmful parents, figure out how to be loved, figure out the transactional dance of that family. So while they're doing all that, they have to earn it and they don't develop a sense of self. Now, one would argue that partly that is the narcissistic person's dilemma, and it's also the traumatized person's dilemma. So I think that what even Ellis's framework is going to miss, while I agree that must is going to result in a lot of personality shaping and harm, there's only a smaller subset becomes narcissistic with that. And the narcissistic subset harms other people. But there are many people who still go through the world feeling they have to win approval to survive, but they're not cruel to other people. In fact, they knock themselves out to accommodate the needs of other people to get their approval. They exhaust themselves in their empathic and their compassionate uphill climb to do right by everyone, leaving nothing for themselves. But in no place in all of that do they lie and betray and manipulate and gaslight. That's the narcissistic people's game. So there might be some similar origin stories, but by the time they get to adulthood, that's going in very, very different directions.
Okay. So that actually, I feel like is really affirming to hear, as someone who, like all of us, navigates the world and sometimes deals with, really challenging people. And is, in my personal journey, I have very actively worked on developing higher levels of empathy. Frankly, it didn't come that naturally to me, probably because I'm an only child and I didn't really learn to share early on. But I saw that as a something that I desired to change about myself and have worked really hard at it. And so I tend to go to the explanation of why a person is the way they are. Like I go there a lot. I think in that regard, I'm somewhat liberal. It's like, oh, well, let's explain everybody away. And but there's a point where there's still personal responsibility. And so I think what you're saying is, and where I'm feeling sort of affirmed in what you said is like, it's okay for me to explain the origin of people's pain, but that doesn't change the fact that not everybody that feels even extreme levels of pain decides that makes it okay to pay it forward to other people.
Right. And keep in mind too, it's that you can, I'm a big fan of understanding where people are coming from, but just because you understand it doesn't make it acceptable. So does that make sense? Like I understand.
And let me ask you a question. I don't want to state it as a truth until I validate it with an expert like yourself. Causing someone else pain doesn't diminish our own experience of any sort of pain, does it?
No, it doesn't diminish.
Even in the short term.
No. If we cause someone else pain, listen, you got to remember there's two subjective experiences in any human interaction. Assuming there's two people, there's three, there's four. But like we like to think that there's one reality. No. There's two. There's two subjective experiences happening. One person, that interaction may be hungry, the other one may not. One person being hungry doesn't make both people hungry. In the most basic example, right? So narcissism is a great example of this. The narcissistic person will cause tremendous pain for the other person in the relationship, almost to a T every time, okay? Then the other person's in their pain. Can we understand the origin story of why that narcissistic person is understanding pain? Absolutely. The ego fragility, the insecurity, the need for grandiose defenses, I understand it. I will not excuse it if they will not take responsibility. And there's the rub. Narcissistic people, it is all but impossible for them to take genuine, authentic responsibility, have empathy that they've caused harm for another person, be self-reflective as to how that happened, and genuinely offer an apology for the pain they caused. Somebody does all that, they probably aren't narcissistic. I'll understand your pain, but I need you to understand what you just did to this person, own it, not blame shift onto them, be accountable, and change your behavior.
So let me ask a question then. As a narcissist, as a hypothetical narcissist, I would say I've experienced such pain, and that's why I do these things.
Okay.
But doing these things doesn't diminish my pain.
No, it doesn't diminish your pain.
Am I confused in the moment, and I think that it will? Is it just a flawed strategy for reducing my own pain? Because otherwise, if causing someone else pain doesn't reduce my pain, why am I doing it as a narcissist?
Well, because because when the narcissistic person is doing it, listen, but as a rule, most narcissistic people, unless we get full-blown dark tetrad, high levels of malignant narcissism is not about sadism. Narcissistic people do not actually intentionally set out to cause pain. This is something that confuses a lot of people because they're thinking like, I feel like they're out to get me. I'm like, nah, that would actually be easier. If they were sadistic, this would all be easier, but they're not sadistic. They're impulsive. Narcissistic people are sort of almost trapped at the stage of development between 3 and 4 years of age. That's about where they are in terms of their self-regulation, in terms of how they go through the world, in terms of how they manage their behavior, 3 or 4 year olds. So there's a lot of impulsivity, there's a lot of tantruming, there's a lot of wanting to get their way. That's all 3 and 4 year olds. I don't know how much time you spent around children, but that is that age group, 3 to 4, pre-Oedipal. Right? And then around 5, 6, superego's fully kicked in. I'm like, can't do that. But these 3, 4 year olds, they will just, they will do and scream and yell. And that's where narcissistic people are. When we think of it that way, people are like, yep, especially if they know from kids, right? So The fact is that narcissistic people are not, as a rule, sadistic. They are immature. They are dysregulated. They are impulsive. The problem is they're not accountable. So it's one thing if somebody's got a short fuse and says, here I go again, and this is so not your problem, and I'm so sorry I keep doing this to you. I've got to get better at this. If you're the other person in that interaction, you may not love it, but you don't feel blamed. The problem with narcissism is the narcissistic person blames the other person for their tantrum. The 4-year-old says, Mommy, it's your fault I'm doing this. Sort of cute in a 4-year-old, but I'm still going to put you in the corner.
Right.
What's the equivalent of the corner for the narcissist as an adult? We don't have that. That's the problem. But that's really what it is. It's not, people are like, listen, when people misbehave and the misbehavior is accountable and doesn't shift blame and attempts to change it, again, we don't love it, but we can endure it. But when we are being blamed for someone else's tantrum, that gets exhausting real fast.
Okay, so I want to ask a personal question to try to make this conversation like hyper tangible for people, and I'm going to throw myself on the altar here. So last night, my wife and I we had a little bit of a tiff, right? Mm-hmm. And I was like walking away, and then I kind of had this feeling come over me of like almost like a get the last word in feeling. Mm-hmm. And I go back downstairs, and for probably 5 minutes, I proceeded to tell her basically why it was her fault that I was being kind of shitty.
Okay, that wasn't okay.
No. Now, 20 minutes later, I was exactly what you're describing. Listen.
Okay.
How I behave is never anyone else's fault, especially you, my love, who is my best friend and is always there for me. And like, I fully owned it. Was I a narcissist for 20 minutes and then I snapped out of it? Or like, is that just like humans, when they're caught up in emotion, sometimes do that thing that the narcissist might do? It's just the narcissist never snaps out of it.
Correct. Humans do we all screw up. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. I always say that relationships can be measured by repair, not by rupture, right? But you can't keep repairing. You can't keep making the same mistake and keep repairing. There has to be learning. So whatever that episode, that interaction was between you and your wife, the real key is going to be that you don't keep going down and saying, these are all the reasons it was your fault. 20 minutes later, I'm sorry. These are all the reasons your fault. 20 minutes later, I'm sorry. Right. You don't get to keep dancing that dance. Next time, the goal is that you don't even go there. You might even say, you know what, hon, I need a minute because I'm still frustrated. So I'm just going to take a second to myself and then I'll be good. But you'll never have done the whole, and these are the reasons it's you. There has to be incremental learning. So I think that one thing that happens in narcissistic relationships is sometimes they will be accountable, but it's very performative and transactional. Like they know that that's what they need to do to keep the trains running on time, but the same mistake keeps happening. Accuse and maybe come back later. Accuse and come back later. Accuse and come back later. Yeah. That doesn't fly.
So for the other party, is it fair to say that your test or your filter for whether or not you're dealing with a narcissist it's not as simple as saying, do they take accountability? Because they might be taking accountability in a very strategic way. Mm-hmm. It's more about, is the behavior recurring?
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
How much can it recur? I mean, because humans, not only are humans prone to error, they're usually prone to error multiple times. Where do you, as a clinician working with someone, start to say, okay, I think we've exceeded the point where it's just like humans being messy and flawed, and now we're into narcissism territory, especially in the case where somebody is owning it, but it perhaps is more of a performance.
Real quick, I want to let you know about my text message community. So I use text messages to provide unique value to my podcast listeners. These texts can just be random thoughts. It can be letting you be the first to know about an event I'm planning or some free training that I'm planning to host for the community. Just shoot me a text to get subscribed to the list. The number is 702-996-3926. Again, that number is 702-996-3926. 3926. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that here's the thing. Most of the people I've ever worked with clinically, they pretty rarely even get the person coming back downstairs after 20 minutes and saying, hey, I'm sorry, but they do sometimes. Listen, I learned an interesting sort of kind of a rule when I was in graduate school. One of my supervisors said to me, Ramani, the first time something happens, it happens. The second time something happens, it's a coincidence. And the third time something happens, it's a pattern. Now, it may not be as simple as 1, 2, 3, but given that most people, not all, but most people, when something is happening in a relationship and early on in the first 6 to 12 months that they're uncomfortable with it, they'll say like, that's not cool. Like, why did you say that to me? That's not my fault. Like, they'll actually fight back.
Right.
And then if the other person they're in a relationship with is narcissistic, you're going to tend to get a much more defensive response. Now, could it be that the person says, absolutely not, this is not my fault. You know, you either take responsibility or I'm out of here. Could the narcissistic person then sort of double back? Sure. Right. So if that happens in early days and that results in shift, I don't even know that I'd call that person narcissistic. Listen, it is one of the big challenges is that some people would argue, and I would agree, but not in all cases, that narcissism is a bit of a post-traumatic state, that people become narcissistic because of early life trauma, whatever that was. And it may even be parental neglect. And parental neglect doesn't necessarily mean they don't feed a kid. It means that no one was emotionally available. No one was really there for the kid, right? And so under those circumstances, it could be, for example, someone stepping out of a room in the middle of an argument would be enough to trigger someone with that kind of a backstory. And then that person starts raging and raging. So even in many narcissistic relationships, I can see that the trigger might have a traumatic origin. But we're talking about best case scenarios right now, Jeff, is that by and large, most people who are in relationships with narcissistic people are facing dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interactions where they're consistently blamed for what's happening in the relationship. And over time, because after a certain amount of time in a relationship, 6 months, a year, 2 years, there's buy-in, there's attachment, there's people want to make the relationship work. Now they're being more careful, the not narcissistic person, as it were, maybe the healthier person. And so they're walking on eggshells, like, I better not talk about that, I better not bring that up. So now the other person in the relationship is shrinking and becoming more and more and more censored, right? So it creates this real asymmetry in the relationship. But because people with narcissism are so riddled with shame, they're always sort of like an unpinned grenade walking through the world, and you don't know what direction the wind is going to have to come from to set them off. It could just be that someone was in their parking spot and they'll completely go insane, and then they'll come home and scream at everyone, and then they had nothing to do with their family when they got home. So in these best case scenarios, yes, people could be accountable, and yes, they may be triggered by something that has an early origin for them. But then also another role, to your point about personal responsibility, is people have to also keep their side of the street clean. And that might mean being vulnerable in therapy and getting the help that they need. A spouse or a girlfriend or a boyfriend or fiance is not a therapist. They are a person in your life. That's not their role. So if this is happening, then there's a responsibility to going and addressing it. And that kind of vulnerable accountability is really tough for someone who's narcissistic. And so I think that, again, when we argue it as an intellectual exercise, any of these things are possible. When we argue it in the real world, none of these things are happening. There isn't all this accountability taking happening. It's
Yeah, and I mean, you're in the trench where most of us, we have a very small experience base of our life and the people in it. Yours is like, you get to do your research vicariously through the lives of all these other people coming through your doors. And so you're saying in practice, most narcissism is like high frequency, and it doesn't involve a lot of this repair.
No,
even if it's for show, even if it's cosmetic.
Not really. And then when there may be show when there's eyes on the situation. So in other words, couples therapy, or there's an audience, like there's other people in the room. And what's very frustrating for people in these relationships is they'll say, we were at the dinner party and everything was just great, but the minute we get in the car, they start screaming at me, or they were screaming at me in the car ride the whole way to the wedding, but at the wedding they were the most charming person. And that's frustrating for people in these relationships because they see that the narcissistic person has the capacity to really turn it on and off. And so, really unskilled people will say, well, that's because they feel safe around you. I'm like, I don't care how safe someone feels around you. Screaming at someone's abuse. That's it.
Yeah.
And if somebody says, but that's how I grew up, I'm like, well, then you need to go address that, because this person you're in a relationship with is saying this is a problem for them.
Yeah. If you grew up in a gang, it doesn't mean you go around shooting people.
But it can.
That's how I grew up.
It can, and we know this. People who grow up under certain circumstances have some risk of replicating those cycles, but actually that's the lower risk. People tend not to replicate; they tend to just be harmed, and that actually, sadly, positions them to get stuck in relationships with people who harm them. So this idea of traumatized people traumatizing other people is not nearly happening at the frequency that traumatized people get re-traumatized.
Interesting. Okay, so that leads exactly where I was about to go with my question, which is like, on the flip side, one of the terms that I've heard in the discussion is narcissistic supply. That there's like this sort of almost like the narcissist is walking around looking for a fuel depot to charge up at, and that fuel depot is usually a traumatized person.
No.
Or someone they can, okay, correct. Yeah, set me straight.
It's not. So a narcissistic person, this idea of narcissistic supply is praise, it's admiration, it's validation, it's social status, or it's some other valued state in the world. Having a really attractive spouse, have a really nice car, having a really big job, having the latest shoes or a great watch or something like that. Things that will pull validation to that person. Narcissistic people are not going around trying to find traumatized people. They're trying to find good supply. And now, if that supply, that praiser, that admirer, that validator, that bringer of status happens to have a trauma history, that person is more likely to get stuck in that relationship, because that person with that trauma history is going to be much more of a candidate to be accommodating, to have a fawn response, to shut down, to walk on eggshells, to be hypervigilant. So they are, quote unquote, better supply because they put up with this sort of one-sided dance for a longer time. But narcissistic people just go for whoever is the best validator.
So they're not maybe as discerning as I'm giving them credit for.
No, you're not. No. And I think that's a big myth.
Yeah, childhood
Yeah,
trauma.
there's a real mythology out there that narcissistic people go for the broken-legged gazelle. Not at all. The narcissistic person wants the shiniest supply. They want the hottest partner. They want the richest partner. They want the most famous. They want the person who thinks they hung the moon. That's what they want. Or the person who, whatever, listens to their entitled rants. That's what they want. Now, like I said, that's why I'm saying people who have histories of trauma are more likely to get stuck in that, because that sort of programming that trauma does to us leads us more likely to doubt ourselves in a relationship and almost think like, well, maybe I'm the problem versus this is not okay.
Yeah, that is a paradigm reset for me in terms of understanding the narcissist pairing dynamic, that it's not that they find traumatized people to be with. It's just that of all the people they found to try to get their needs met from, it was those that were traumatized that were most likely to end up stuck.
Yeah, exactly, to stick around. Yeah, because the traumatized people were more likely to question themselves.
Yeah, okay, interesting. So I'm sure that kind of like the number one thing that people want to know from you, and I suppose I'm no different here, is like, if a person's listening to this thinking, I wonder if so-and-so person in my life, I think they might be a narcissist. Like, do you have sort of a heuristic that you give people to make that assessment? And then I assume a strategy on what to do about it?
Yeah, I'd say one thing is you're not going to learn this on one crack at bat. Like, you need to get to know someone. So upon the first time meeting someone, listen, Jeff, I'm guilty of this. I will meet someone. In fact, I had a meeting today where I was sort of like, oh my God, this person is narcissistic. But actually, when I really saw them, I actually, no, they're not. I realized they were just simply incompetent. But it was, we have those moments. But really, even in this case, if this person was really aggravating me, I thought, no, I need to meet with this person several more times. So you're never going to learn this on a first meeting. So there's everyone, what are the top 5 red flags, Dr. Ramani? So I know. No, this doesn't work like that. Okay. So you're not going to get it at a first blush. The second is, I tell folks, is that you're looking for patterns in behavior, right? So you're looking for that this is relatively consistent. And the problem with establishing consistency is it takes time. I have rarely seen a person in an intimate relationship clearly get a look at someone's narcissism in much quicker than a year. Years not a short period of time. Now, sometimes a relationship will fall apart because you just aren't into the person, or they got something else going on, or they're dating multiple people, and lucky you. But if you lasted out a year, it's around then that it's going to start feeling a little funky. So, I mean, there's things you look for. I often say to folks, look at a person's reactivity to situations when they're stressed. But by stressed, I mean they're not getting their way. It goes back to one of your Albert Ellis points, right? That things in life have to be the way I want them to be. Right? Narcissistic, that that entitlement is a form of grandiosity. I'm so special that everything should go my way. And so that means that even traffic feels like a personal affront to a narcissistic person. And so they will be screaming and yelling at traffic. They'll be screaming and yelling if they don't get the table, and not even screaming and yelling. Maybe they'll get sullen and quiet and withdrawn, but they'll definitely show this incredible displeasure at things where you'd like to see a bit more resilience in the face of. Pay attention to that. If you find yourself doing a lot of ego babysitting in a relationship with someone, pay attention to that, because this listen, none of us do great under stress, but again, the more flexible and the more stress resilient someone else is, better. That's healthy. But when you see a person really not only personalizing these things, but then that becomes a jumping off point for them to lash out at you or someone else, that's a not okay. And that might be already that sort of soft narcissistic sign. I would say another place that you would see narcissism is, it's all these narcissistic folks are now calling themselves ADHD, is they will interrupt. They won't listen. They will do something else, look at their phone or fool with something else. And when you're like, hey, aren't you listening to me? Oh, I have ADHD or some such nonsense. And so it's this sense of what you have to say isn't that important. And whatever that honeymoon period of love bombing is where it seemed like it was important, that fades. And anytime you bring it up, they'll come up with some sort of excuse, ADHD being a common one, of why they can't pay attention to you. That's another kind of a real sign that we would see. That lack of empathy, you'll definitely feel that. It will be a lot of minimization of what you're going through, or invalidation of what you're going, or dismissiveness. And then there's the almighty gaslighting. Now, not all people who gaslight are narcissistic. Many are, but not all. All narcissistic people, though, gaslight. And gaslighting is not just a disagreement. Gaslighting is not a difference of opinion. Gaslighting is not even just lying. Gaslighting is when somebody tells you your experience, your memory, your beliefs, any are just patently wrong, and you're crazy, and there's something wrong with you for having them. You need that second part of being told, like, you're the dumbest person for not even being able to remember this. Like, you're the most disorganized person. I can't believe I'm in a relationship with you. Like, who can't find their keys? So it's that kind of, like, you feel literally demeaned for making little kinds of mistakes. So you feel smaller and smaller. If you feel embarrassed to talk about your relationship, you find yourself withholding some of the experiences that are happening when you talk about this relationship with other people. That's not a great sign either. That could be indicative that some of the patterns are already sort of unsettling for you. But Jeff, this can take at least a year. By a year, people have got a lot of buy-in to a relationship. And not everything that happens in a narcissistic relationship is bad. And part of the problem is there's a lot of good stuff. This might be someone you find really attractive, really fun. They're smart. They come up with interesting things to do. You have shared interests. Like, you may really be engaged by this person. And this is why narcissism is so confusing. These are very socially successful people, and often life successful. They're often really ambitious and really hardworking and really focused and really, and fun. And they like doing things in the world. On average, most narcissistic people are extroverted. And so a lot of people feel as though, wow, I found my person. I'm having so much fun. And that kind of blocks out. Like, people say, you know what? I'm finding ways to talk myself out of this relationship. And so that backing and forthing between good and bad, praise and criticism, all of that, that's something we call the trauma bond. And so people kind of get stuck in not being able to pull away because they're kind of cleaved to that good stuff, and not understanding that the bad stuff is probably a good sign that you may want to exit if you can.
Yeah. So would the general guidance be, look, it takes time for these things to materialize. And frankly, even as they start to materialize different facets of them, it's still probably too soon to call it narcissism, or it might be something else. But at least, even if it's something else, it's probably not something great. So,
well, and I think that this is where, as much as the narcissism frame is such an important one and a useful one, the word is getting tricky for people because they're getting so obsessed with trying to figure out, are they narcissistic or not? When I want to say, can you tell me what your experience is like with them? Because I actually don't care, because it sounds like you're not always having a great time with this. Right. And so it's your experience with this person. Because I'll be frank with you, there may be someone else who spends time with this person and some of this stuff may not bother them the same way. Remember, we bring a history into this too. So I've got a dear friend, and so we were talking about people who are yellers. I don't do well with people who yell. People who yell, I shut down. And now I'm at an age and stage of my life. If you yell in my presence, we're done. I'm not doing it. But at this earlier stage of my career, I didn't have that luxury. She has no problem with yelling. And I said, how are you able to do this? She said, my father was a massive yeller. And so I grew up with yelling and it scared me to death. She grew up with yelling and she acclimatized to it. So we, as two different human beings, had very different reactions to it. So she'd end up in relationships that look very different than mine. Now, I'm not saying the relationships she ends up in are very healthy, but the effect the yelling has on her I would have been like either in a psychiatric hospital, or I would have run out of the relationship had I been her, right? It wasn't having that effect on her. So we have our own history. And I always tell people, just because everyone else says, well, that wouldn't bother me, who gives a damn? They're not you. Right. You're the one who's having this experience and you don't like it. Not everybody likes pepperoni on their pizza. Why would people be any different?
So is the general prescription then, like, look, it takes time for these things to surface, so just take time.
Take time.
Take time. Take a year. Don't make any commitments that would be really hard to unwind in the first year of a relationship.
Yep. And pay attention to how this relationship feels to you. Because the big problem we have is we tend to reference out on our relationship. Like, do you think this dude is cool? Like, do you think this is cool? Does it feel okay to you? And I'll say to folks, this is happening. Do you want to spend 30 years doing this? Do you want to spend 50 years with this? Like, really, because this is you. I don't care that your sister wouldn't be bothered by this. I don't care that your friends wouldn't be bothered by this. How do you feel? It could be, for example, someone's very ambitious and they're in a relationship with someone who's like, we can't work on the weekend. That's not, someone else might love that, right? But another person might say, this feels really controlling. Like, I feel like on Friday, I'm having a panic attack because this person's getting mad because I took out my laptop. So that's my point. Would I say that a person who doesn't want to work on the weekend is narcissistic? No. But if they hold that as some kind of almighty edict, it would feel really controlling. And if you're someone who doesn't have that kind of job, it's not going to work.
Yeah. I guess in that sense, it is like relative. We get to be the decider of what works for us or not, and the need to put a label on it could be counterproductive in that regard, because they are focused on the accuracy of the label versus our own needs.
And the accuracy of the label is that it's almost as though it's giving people this kind of turbocharged excuse to say, well, they're narcissistic. That's
I was going to say, it's really about what we say to other people is why we want the label to be validated. But one question that I've always sort of wondered is, we're not always the same as individuals. Like, I think like the kind of the transactional analysis model, Eric Burney, that there's like, we all have a child state and a parent state and an adult state, right? And then in different relationships, our inner child might be bringing out someone else's inner parent, and it's our child state and their parent state are transacting. Neither one of us is operating in our adult state. And I don't know where modern psychology is on the transactional, Bernie's model, but like, I do think about that a lot. Like, in the world, I'm like, I kind of feel like I'm dealing with the 3-year-old version of this person.
But I'm not convinced that the adult version of that person exists.
Okay. So that's what I was going to ask is like, are there cases where people almost like move in and out of being narcissistic because it's a state, but it's not always necessarily their permanent state? Or am I overcomplicating?
I think what's challenging with, I think that there's sort of like, it's, to me, sort of the interpersonal state of a person is what matters, right? So it's how they express emotion, how they regulate emotion, how they're able to attuned to another human being, right? That's the key. And the challenge with a narcissistic person is, despite that, I don't think they've ever gotten past 3 or 4 years of age, they've gotten the adult information. They know how to do something, right? They have a skill. So because they have that skill, they can show up to the job and do the skill. They have the words, they have the physical body of an adult, right? So we give a lot of credence to people who do adulty things. They live in adulty houses and they have matching dishes and they go to a job and they put on a suit and they make a salary and they have a 401. Like, this is all adulty stuff. But I'll be frank with you, if a person cannot regulate and cannot attune and cannot empathize, and they throw tantrums and they're impulsive, that's 4. And they may also be in their little adulty world still not able to regulate. So if in that very grown-up-y seeming world, they don't get their way, 4 is always in the house. They just created all this window dressing. So I think that, again, and if we really take Bernie's work and we really elevate it to what we're seeing with Dick Schwartz's work and all the stuff on internal family systems and even the trauma models around parts work and all of that the traumatized self is a fragmented self, right? So it's the dissociated and fragmented states are how the traumatized person can get through the world. So we're not showing up as all of us. We're showing up as inner child. We're showing up as protector. We're showing up as manager, whatever it may be. So all these parts don't get integrated into a whole because there was no way to be safe showing up as our whole. Our inner child was too vulnerable and all of that. So I think that kind of builds on that. At the end of the day, it goes back to a point I was making earlier. I am not going to be your trauma therapist if I'm in a relationship with you. And could be your trauma therapist. You know what I'm saying? Right. I could be my partner's trauma therapist. I said, unless you want to start writing me checks, I'm not doing that. Like, I'm not sitting here and doing the math on your trauma history. And so I'm not interested. I'm interested in how I feel right now and how you need to show up. And so that, I think, is that I agree with you that there are these different ways we, if you will, transact. But the challenge is that these are inherently asymmetric relationships where the narcissistic person is almost consistently showing up as the child, which almost inevitably pushes the other person in the relationship into a constant adult role. And before you know it, it's now you're parenting a very spoiled child who has all the power. It's like a Twilight Zone episode at that point.
Yeah. Well, especially, it's like if the 3-year-old in your house was also the breadwinner.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's the 3-year-old's the breadwinner and has the keys to the car and the house.
And often maybe are physically the strongest person in the house.
And physically the strongest person in the house. Yeah.
Man, okay. I am sad that we are out of time because this is like so fascinating and interesting and I think really valuable for so many people. So on that note, how can the audience go learn more from you and get to know you better?
Yeah, no, please look in, if you are in one of these relationships and saying, I just don't know the path forward, please do look into my book, It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. We're on the New York Times bestseller list. We were named Audible's one of Audible's top 10 audiobooks of the year. So it really has been received well by people all over the world. And so please look into that. We also have a healing program, a more intensive sort of monthly program for people who are interested in sort of doing the work on healing. And we have workshops and programs on that. We have the Dr. Ramani Network, which is a weekly sort of live question answer, kind of has a podcast vibe, but like everyone's questions on narcissism are getting answered. You can find all that stuff on my website. You can follow me on social media at Dr. Ramani, where everything I'm doing is always kind of sort of shared with the world. But I think that the more people understand this and can give themselves permission to say, this doesn't feel okay, this isn't okay. And instead of my rationalizing another person's behavior, I can give myself permission to say, this isn't okay. It doesn't mean you're getting up and leaving. It doesn't mean you're getting a divorce. It doesn't mean you're going to stop talking to your mother. But maybe you can stop taking responsibility for another person's abusive behavior of you.
Beautiful, kind of a mic drop.
Thank you.
I love that. Awesome. Dr. Ramani, thank you so much for being
Thank you, Jeff.
This has been wonderful.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And of course, to all you viewers and listeners, you know what I'm going to say. You are the best part of this show, even when the good doctor is on. Thank you so much for spending this time together. We can't wait to see you on the next one. Take care.
If you loved that episode, then you're definitely going to love this one. Check it out.
If failure can be a powerful teacher, then why do we wait for it to happen? Why don't we intentionally design for it in a safe way?
Dr. Manu Kapoor,
learning scientist who developed the theory of productive failure
to unlock deeper learning through the science of failure.